The reason that we got involved with the area of sort of cancer fundraising and specifically fundraising for either unproven or disproven treatments is that I'd seen for a number of years, and I'm sure many people had as well, these stories that would appear on social media or stories that would appear in the paper, and they'd always be about a patient who've been told by the NHS that there's nothing left that the NHS can do, but they found this pioneering treatment in another country that the NHS can't support or refuses to support, and now all they need to do is raise the thousands and thousands of pounds it costs to go over and get this treatment. And almost always when you look into where these patients are going and what treatments they're getting, those treatments don't stand up to scrutiny, they don't stand up to the evidence. But when it comes to try and tackle that, it's very difficult, because if you start questioning the patient, well, the patient has just been given a pretty scary diagnosis and you can't really explain to them why it doesn't work. If you try and tackle it at the friends and family who are donating to them, these people just want to do something good for people in their lives. Even the media, they just see this as a story of a human interest story. A person gets a terrible tragedy happen to them and a community rallies around to help them. So it's really difficult to tackle it at an individual level, and yet we had this sense that there was a huge amount of these stories out there, and a huge number of clinics all around the world peddling treatments that they claim cure cancer that don't really offer any benefit to patients at all. And patients are spending their last weeks, their last months, their thousands of pounds of their own money, remortgaging their houses, cashing in their pensions, their family cashing in pensions, taking out loans, all to go for something that was offering nothing but false hope. And that's really where we started to get involved. And the crowdfunding side of it was a big thing for us. You see on Just Giving and GoFundMe and a few other kind of those kind of crowdfunding sites, you see these huge campaigns that would be the basis of the newspaper reporting and hugely spread on social media. And they'd get huge amounts of prominence, and there'd be literally hundreds of thousands of pounds. There was one particular case that Kate Winslet got involved with promoting, and she almost certainly believed this was genuinely going to help the lady at the centre of this story. But hundreds of thousands of pounds went to this fundraiser, and unfortunately the treatment they were looking for had no real hope of helping anybody. And so you end up with patients being sold false hope, spending the last months alive in a foreign country, in uncomfortable surroundings, getting uncomfortable treatment for something that absolutely can't benefit them. And that's where we stepped in to try and examine how big a problem this is and what can be done about it. Well, I think there's a couple of things to do. And first of all, it's looking at the crowdfunding campaigns themselves, the crowdfunding sites. We found something like 500 campaigns over the course of 5 years that were specifically for unproven treatments. Around about £7 million raised, £5 million that were going to clinics in Germany. £4.5 million were going to a single clinic in Germany that was making a huge amount of money from these campaigns. And obviously you also had the issue of Just Giving and GoFundMe, who would have their own fees on all of these fundraisers. So they'd be taking a little slice of that money. So it was very hard to incentivize them, you would argue. They were perhaps incentivized not to tackle this problem. But one of the things we said was, if you are a crowdfunding platform, you don't accept any crowdfunder. Not just anyone can't stand a crowdfunder for anything. You clearly have some rules in place for what is an appropriate reason to be crowdfunding. So you should add to that list of rules that you can't crowdfund for something that's claiming to have a medical benefit it does not have. And we weren't asking the crowdfunding sites. They said, well, we're not cancer experts, how are we supposed to know? I said, well, you don't need to make that decision. But if anybody mentions something to do with cancer or some of the clinics or some of the treatments we know aren't effective, if they mention that in their fundraiser, put those fundraisers in a quarantine area and then ask an expert to look over them. Because you can actually stem a huge amount of the flow of money and time that's going into these clinics abroad. You can stem that at the source if you stop the crowdfunding for it. There's a huge amount of money and a huge amount of profit that's being made from those clinics. So it can certainly be tackled at that port. The other place that we set out to tackle it was to explain to the media why these stories have to be treated like science stories, like health stories. These aren't just human interest, where you say person X was ill, a community rallied around them, they're now going for treatment, it's going to be great. And then what inevitably happens is something bad happens to that person and the media does not follow up, because the story, person who had cancer dies of cancer, isn't a story to the media. So we actually wrote to all the journalists who'd ever covered one of these stories and all the main newspapers, all the health desks, to say, when these things come up, you have to realise that the clinics who are promoting these alternative cancer treatments, they aren't allowed to take out advertising in the UK to say we can cure cancer. That would be in breach of the 1939 Cancer Act. They don't need to take out advertising if they have every national and local newspaper saying, here's a person who got cured at our clinic. So these clinics don't need to do advertising if the media is doing the advertising for them. And the way to stop being inadvertently used as advertising for quackery is to treat these stories with the level of scrutiny that a scientific story needs. If they're saying they're going abroad for treatment the NHS won't fund, you look into why the NHS won't fund it. You ask a cancer expert, what is this treatment and could it work? And if the treatment couldn't possibly work, you either report it that way or you spike the story. Because one of the most tragic things that I saw when I was undertaking our investigation, and to be clear, what our investigation was to look at every single cancer fundraiser we could find from the UK on GoFundMe and Just Giving and the various of the crowdfunding sites, identify what treatments were being sought and if those treatments were effective or not, and then sort of total it all up to figure out how many of these cases are out there, how much money is being raised, where's the money going, and what treatments is it going on. And the real tragedies that we saw along the way, there were some really awful patterns would emerge. And one of those patterns was you'd have a patient who'd be persuaded that this clinic was going to cure their cancer. They'd get a story in the local newspaper or the national newspaper about how this was a miracle cure for them. The patient would go off to that clinic and unfortunately they would die. But you'd see a second patient saying, I saw that story in the newspaper and that's why I went to the clinic myself. And you see their story go up on the clinic's website as a testimonial or in a local newspaper saying, this has cured my cancer. And you see a third patient pick up on that second story, even after that second patient has unfortunately died. You have this chain of events where the media is being used to launder these cancer cure claims into public consciousness, but not following up on what actually happens. And we tried to follow up on what actually happened and found actually, unfortunately, in a large number of those cases, you can actually see where things haven't worked out for the patient long after the media have turned to another story and long after the clinic has found another patient.